Hi. Hi. Hey, Em, how are you?
I'm good. How
Uh,
are you?
Good. Hopefully you can
Good.
hear me okay. That's funny.
I
Just
can.
when it went live, like some bird like jumped on the roof at my house. It was really loud.
Perfect.
Um, okay, well I think we're live. I think it's working. Um, Though I'm not sure, but we'll just go with it. Um, yeah, I think we are. Anyway, I just wanted to welcome you and say how excited I am to talk to you today. And introduce you, Melanie Camellia,
Hmm.
who I get to talk to all the time. So I feel very lucky that I get to have these conversations a lot. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking with all of us today.
Sure.
Um, yeah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I'm Melanie Camellia. I also just go by my first initial, M. Um, and I am based in the Washington, D.C. area, in Silver Spring, Maryland. So we just got our stay-at-home order this morning. Goes into effect at 8 p.m.
Wow.
Um, so that's where I am in the world. And I am a yoga teacher here in the area. I travel to teach. I do teaching mentorship one-on-one with new and experienced teachers alike. And I work with Jivana at Accessible Yoga.
Yay.
Yay!
And I love when you teach, especially when you teach about this topic, this topic of agency, generally queer perspective on yoga in general, one of my favorite things.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if maybe we could start with a centering of some
Yeah,
kind.
yeah,
Yeah, will you guide us?
yeah, I will. So
Okay.
let's do a little sensory and breath centering. So if you're following along with us, you could choose to close your eyes or soften your gaze, maybe look down at your lap or at the floor. And then you might turn your palms up towards the ceiling, towards the sky. And then from there, just take a moment to notice your breath as it's happening without necessarily making any changes to it. Just noticing all of the inhale and all of the exhale. And then, if you would choose to deepen your breath, you could start taking a slightly longer inhale, maybe an even longer exhale out your nose. And then, keeping your breath steady, you might notice the palms of your hands turned up and connected to the air around you, through the air to the space around you. And really tune into anything that your hands are feeling, that your fingers are feeling. And you could choose to keep your hands turned up, or you could turn them down now, maybe palms to your thighs, or the seat, or the ground, or the desk near you, whatever that might be. And if you chose to turn your hands down, you might notice any different sensations that you're feeling in your palms, fingers, wrists. Just noticing what it's like to connect a little differently to your body or to the space. And then perhaps bring your attention back to your breath, back to noticing. And you could remain there, simply noticing. Or maybe take the next breath deeply in through your nose and then open your mouth, let it all out like a sigh. And then maybe do that 2 more times, inhaling deeply and letting it go. One more. And then finally, you might bring the palms of your hands together, the center of your chest. Just one more point of contact, noticing any sensation between your hands. You're welcome to keep your hands still, or if it would feel nice to rub them together to notice that friction or passive heat, you could try that. And then maybe settle the hands to stillness if they're moving, or they're touching, or in another position. And maybe take one more deep breath. And then you could part your hands, make yourself comfortable. And if and as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Let the light back in, let the space back in. Here we are.
Thank you. That was awesome. I love when you teach.
Thank you.
I wanted to say more about how we work together, because I think it's only fair that people know that you basically like manage the trainings, the accessible yoga training. So people, if they've taken a training or they sign up for one, you're the person they talk to.
That's true.
And,
I have access to all sorts of personal information about you.
what else do you do? You do kind of like you work for the nonprofit Accessible Yoga too, like tech. What do you call it? IT? What do you call it?
It's more like web administration, I would say, which is technology focused, but I'm not like running internal networks and servers or anything like that.
Right. And now you're a trainer for accessible yoga too. You're doing a training.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Hopefully. And when is that one? That's in DC?
Well, I've got a few. I have one scheduled in Gettysburg for August, and then DC in November, and Ottawa, Ontario in December.
Right.
Those are all on the books right now, but we're taking
hopefully.
Everything a day at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully we'll be back to in-person training sometime soon. And just how are you personally? So you said you just got your stay-at-home orders there today, which is amazing too. I'm in California. We've had it for, I think, almost 2 weeks. Like that's like normal life here now, you know?
Yeah. I don't think our governor can win, frankly. I think there was plenty of upset when he made his last announcement, which was just to like strongly encourage social distancing and to close certain types of non-essential businesses. And a lot of folks didn't think that was enough. And then the actual stay-at-home starts tonight at 8. And I know folks are like, some folks are still like, this is too little, too late. And others are like, why are we doing this? Doesn't seem pertinent, but yeah, it finally came today. We were expecting it. I mean, I was expecting it anyway.
Yeah. And how are you during this time? I mean, personally.
I'm doing all right. I'm working alone. I do a lot of work from home. For me, home translates more to being in a cafe and just being around the energy of people that I don't have to actually interact with. So working from home has been a bit of a transition. And certainly working from my actual apartment while my wife is also here working. That's new. Co-working a little bit.
Yeah, that's what I have the issue I'm having too. I mean, I mostly work from home too, unless I'm traveling and teaching. But now to have my husband here working is interesting, and our son is home. So it's pretty intense just to be together all the time with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's intense, and we live in a small space. I mean, we live in a 1-bedroom apartment, so it's pretty close quarters. At least there is a door that we can close in between us. We're trying to be a little preemptive. We're not sick of each other yet, but just trying to have a little bit of separation when we can, just so we don't necessarily get to that point.
But you're recently married, so there's still like the honeymoon period. Right?
That's true. We got married in November.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going on almost 28 years, my husband and I.
Yeah.
So
which
We're
is not to make you feel old, but about as long as I've been alive.
Yeah, that makes me feel old. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because we're used to being with each other all the time, but it's also bad because we really know each other's issues. You know, we know how to
Hmm.
push each other's buttons for sure. But
Yeah.
we've been through a lot together, so in a way, it's just it kind of feels like, oh, here we are again. Like we've had
Hmm.
a lot of drama, a lot of issues for so many years, and we figured it out. So I think
Yeah.
you know. Um, and actually, a lot part of that goes back to AIDS. Really, when we first met, we were just both, you know, had so many friends sick and dying, and we met actually at ACT UP, you know, the AIDS
Hmm.
activist group. That's where we met, and actually, we met because it's a real. I mean, I don't know if I should tell this story, but I might as well. Um, we were at this ACT UP meeting, and Matt was new to the meeting. I'd been going to these ACT UP San Francisco meetings for years. And I thought, oh, wow, there's a cute new guy here. And then they wanted someone to do childcare because someone had brought their kids and they didn't want the kids to be at the meeting. So they asked, would anyone volunteer to do childcare, you know, downstairs? And he raised his hand. And so then I did because I was like, oh, I can go hang out with him. And so then we went and we babysat for these two little kids, which is funny because we actually have two kids now.
Hmm.
And that's how we met. And I was like amazed that he liked to hang out with kids and he wanted to have kids. So we bonded over that.
That's really cute.
Yeah, it was pretty cute. Anyway, so yeah, let's talk about
Hmm.
this stuff, our topic.
Yes.
I mean,
Let's.
yeah. So I mean, I just for me, that's my perspective is coming from having lived through the AIDS epidemic.
Hmm.
There's certainly things that are similar and so many things that are different. But I feel like one thing that feels similar to me is that um, marginalized communities continue to be marginalized, and it's just highlighted by a crisis.
Hmm.
And that was really a big part of what was happening with AIDS. But I think we're
Yeah.
seeing it now too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing it differently, I think, but seeing it for sure. Um, it occurred to me in thinking about this call, just the ways that queer and trans people in particular, not more so than other vulnerable communities, but are vulnerable in a lot of their own ways, in unique ways. Um, and yeah, I mean, I know I listed them all out for you in an email, and I don't need to read through the whole email now, but certainly um,
Yeah.
there are some considerations in terms of things like smoking rates or substance use rates that could impact risk factor in this situation. Definitely considerations around mental health. There's a disproportionate representation of queer and trans folks in communities that are looking for mental health support in the day-to-day world, not even necessarily just as there's a global pandemic that's causing increased anxiety, but there's different ways that that can play an impact. There are a lot of trans folks who rely in some way on the healthcare system to have their gender affirmative needs met, which I have worries about as our healthcare system gets overrun, just how everyone's going to get access to those services. And then certainly in terms of economic impact, there are a lot of places in the country where we don't have workplace protections based on gender or sexuality anyway. So folks who are queer or trans are already vulnerable in terms of employment and income and are disproportionately represented in communities experiencing homelessness or just living in poverty, right? Have less income or less stable access to benefits and healthcare.
Yeah,
So all of that.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
part that I've been thinking about is that with the stay-at-home orders, I mean, it's one thing if you have a stable home,
Mm-hmm.
that's safe and
Mm-hmm.
where you're not in danger. But if you,
Mhm.
you know, there are many reasons why people don't have that. And I think that makes this whole stay at home thing much more serious for people who either are marginally housed or maybe are victims of domestic violence. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of that in the queer community too. I mean, there's domestic violence.
Yeah.
There's also maybe younger queer people who don't feel safe in their homes if they still live with their parents, maybe, or they don't, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like maybe they don't have a choice, but they're having to live
Yep.
with people that don't really support them.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely happening. I know even those who are maybe older or say around my age, I mean, most of my friends at least live separately from families, whether they've had family drama or not. But that definitely also cuts it off as a source of ongoing support during this time. So there's a lot of queer and trans folks who may not necessarily be able to ask family for a little financial support if they lose
Mhm.
their employment, or to house them if they lose their housing right now. Um, and I also know a lot of folks who live in group housing scenarios who are trying to build intentional queer community
Yeah.
by creating co-housing situations, even not necessarily just in their youth. I know we think about that as maybe like college students or early 20s living in group houses, but I know plenty of people in their 30s and 40s who are trying to live in communal housing to build an alternative structure of care and more of a chosen family. But having
Mm.
more people in that dense situation means a
Yeah.
lot of negotiation right now, and more risk than maybe living with one partner or living in a nuclear family situation.
Yeah. And and regarding the topic, I wonder if you could help define agency, what we were talking in the title of this conversation, because I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a term that I think a lot of people don't understand, especially in relationship to the work that you do and the work and yoga
Mm-hmm.
in general, like where agency is involved. Um,
Yeah. I define agency as resources plus action. So, resources being sort of this broad list of things that are available to you, which could be material resources like money, like food, like um, a computer or a phone or things to work on, right? It can also be your time, it can also be your energy, right? What do you have to exert or to use in your daily life or in this moment? And then action being how you use them. So, agency really meaning freely using your resources how you choose to
mhm.
use them in any given moment.
So, how you use your resources and how does that relate to yoga? Because I've heard you speak about that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think of yoga as a liberatory practice. So, for me, when I think of yoga, I'm thinking about an experience that leads to freedom. And when I think about freedom, I think about agency. So that's sort
Mm,
of how it tracks for me, is that I see this as a practice that's meant to free us. And if we're going to be successful in that, then we need to understand what freedom is.
mm,
Um, and it also brings me to the topic of consent, which I think is tied very closely with agency, right? I think consent is one aspect of agency and vice versa. So
mhm,
um, it comes down to me to maybe even thinking about some of the yogic concepts that we talk about a lot, like surrender
mm, mm,
or discipline, um, and thinking about what surrender actually implies or what it means, what discipline implies, what it means. And we can't really do that, I don't think, without looking at power structures and decision making, choice making, which is rooted in our agency. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I just actually want to go back to something you just said. So you said
Mm-hmm.
liberation, and
Mm-hmm.
then and I think that maybe we could like define that within yoga because I feel like that word is used as like a overall. I think it's like it's a very broad term that I think is used.
Hmm.
You said yoga is a liberation practice, but I think that it has two meanings for me. One is that it's liberation regarding spiritual enlightenment, you could say,
Hmm.
right? There's just like that word liberation could be used instead of enlightenment. But I don't think that's what you mean. I feel like you're talking about more practical. Am I wrong? Or are you
I
talking
think
about
I
both?
mean both.
Both.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yes, I think for me, the way that I have come to view things, both through experiences as a queer person, trans person, like my experiences in the tangible world and in our society, but also my experiences with yoga and learning yoga and teaching yoga. Um, I fundamentally understand things that are true to be few between and also scalable and applicable across situations, right? I think that there are very few truths, but that those truths are ultimately universal.
Hmm.
And I want to see liberation of the spiritual sort, that enlightenment, mirrored in everything else, right? The way that we operate in our day to day lives. And I see that as being somewhat multi directional. The more we learn about spiritual liberation, the more we're able to translate that into how we exist in the world. And also, the more we learn about freedom in the world and how to create equity in our communities and agency within our communities, the more we're able to translate that into our spiritual experience and understand what it might actually take to seek an ultimate freedom, right?
And why
An
is that? Just can you
enlightenment.
say more about that last part? Why is that liberation in the world
Hmm.
important for spiritual practice or something? You know what I mean? Is that
Hmm. I mean, I simply see them as tied. I
hmm.
think that it's it's in part about the experience and being able to learn those lessons and also to give everybody access to them to work towards understanding, right? So the work we do in the world, let's just go one direction for
Yeah.
ease of my brain.
Yeah.
Whenever I am working to understand how we create more equity or inclusion or access in the world, I'm looking at that, certainly working towards that, figuring out what resources that might take, what brain shifts that might take, what reorganization that might take. And then I'm trying to boil that down to sort of this central teaching, the central lesson there that could potentially be applicable to different sorts of liberation, including spiritual practice. So if we think about things like resource sharing, which is something coming up a lot right now in community
Yeah.
care, and you've had lots of great conversations about that. Um, as we work out systems of more equitably sharing our resources, which I would say another word for our resources is our power. As we work out systems for more equitably sharing our resources in the material world, how can we take those systems and what we're learning from their efficacy and apply that to spiritual practice and to how we seek those same ideals and those same truths in the spiritual sense?
Hmm.
How does it scale and translate?
Yeah. I mean, I love that question because I think that's personally like the root of my work. I mean, that's what accessible
Mm-hmm.
yoga is. It's like trying to um, address what I see as I don't know if the word is discrimination, but some kind of lack of power agency that exists within the yoga community,
Mm-hmm.
where certain people are given a lot of attention and are made to think this is the practice for them, and they're invited to, their image is up on the walls and studios
Mm-hmm.
and yoga clothing stores. And I think accessible yoga is about trying to change that understanding that that yoga isn't about any particular person, any particular
Mm-hmm.
body or way of being in the world, or gender or sexuality. That the yoga teachings are universal truths that
Mm-hmm.
apply to all of us. So So I guess what I understand you're saying too is that like we can use our experience in the world. Maybe I get this wrong, but let me know what you think. We can use our
Hmm.
experience in the world. So like as a queer man, I can like think, oh, well, I've learned because of the challenges I've had around my own personal freedom and liberation. I actually have learned. I've been able to use that actually as an experience to grow personally and actually address and bring that into my spiritual practice. It
Hmm.
actually informs my spiritual practice because my practice is really all about equity and accessibility because I know that I've been left out.
Hmm.
And that's how it actually, so not only has it informed the way I practice and like spirituality, but it actually informs my, well, everything that I do. Everything.
Right. Absolutely. And I've
Yeah.
written a lot in the past about um, understanding myself as a queer person to as being sort of an existential spur that made me ask the questions that eventually brought me to yoga.
Right.
And I think that that's true for both you and I, it sounds like. But it's also, the first time in my life that I had to address something undeniable that was
Mm.
arising from within me and not from some external authority. And I think that that's some of the understanding that comes into play also when we're talking about agency and power dynamics and consent. That
Mm.
we, as yoga practitioners, are working to discern, like, what is the authority that I'm going to follow in my conduct? Is it going to
Mm.
be something that's coming from within me
Mm.
slash within our sort of universal connected body? Or is it going to come from a constructed power structure that's outside of me? And
Yeah.
the first time I had to answer that question for myself was when I was coming out, was when I had to say, I'm looking at the society that's telling me that this is not who I'm supposed to love or how I'm supposed to feel, and yet it's not something that I can switch off. It's an undeniable truth about me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Reckoning with that was the first time I really had to question um, what I was taking as authority and what I was letting control my decisions and my actions. Right.
Yeah.
But it's through that lens too that I see all sorts of other constructs and beliefs being used to shape our everyday interactions, and sometimes, often, I think, sliding under our radar to the point where we don't necessarily even understand to what extent we're being controlled by an external authority, whether that's a government or a partner or a parent, or a teacher. I mean, we set up all of these sort of
Right.
hierarchical structures
Yeah.
within which that power dynamic means that it's difficult to see where our own decision making is coming from without
Yeah.
being able to discern and parse that apart.
Yeah. And how do we do that? How do you shift that in yoga, say in a yoga class, for example? Because
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that's the challenge I think for yoga students is
Mm-hmm.
that yoga is almost always taught in that kind of a power structure where the teacher
Mm-hmm.
has power, has some kind of position um,
Mm-hmm.
and privilege in the yoga space, and then the students don't have. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we have created a yoga culture that just mimics society in general in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we teach yoga right now, for the most part in group classes,
Yeah.
it just replicates the power structures that exist out in the outer world outside of our yoga spaces. And that's part of what I'm talking about when I talk about sort of translating these truths and these lessons that we're learning across different areas of understanding. That if we look at our work in social justice, and what we're talking about in those conversations is, leveling hierarchical structures of power and raising up marginalized communities and finding, a sort of equality through our equity work, then why aren't we applying that to our other structures, right? Why aren't we
Mm,
applying that truth and that strategy to our yoga classes, but not just our yoga classes, to our businesses, to our families,
mm,
right? Um, yeah.
That's a
So
great
in a yoga
question.
class, mhm. Well, and this is my goal. Like, this is when I think about alignment in terms of yoga, I don't
Mhm.
think about some sort of postural alignment. I think about, am I aligning everything in my life and in my conduct with yogic ideal, with the lessons that I'm learning through the practice.
Uh,
And for me, that looks like looking at each of those areas of life and seeing if they align, right? And so I'm working on that in my business structuring and how I make offerings, but also in my family life and also in how I teach classes. And so to get to your question about what that might look like when working with students, it looks like working towards power sharing and giving as much agency and empowerment as possible to students. And in practice, that means letting them know what all of their options are. Because I fundamentally believe that there cannot be the possibility of a yes without the possibility of a no. So if I only give you one option and the only answer is yes, if I say put your foot here, and I don't give you the
mm,
opportunity to say no,
mm,
then you can't honestly consent to putting your foot there. It
uh,
doesn't mean you wouldn't choose to,
yeah.
given all your other options. That might be true, but you won't know unless you know that there are other options available to you.
Yeah. Um, I love that. Someone's asking though if we can tie this directly into COVID and what's happening
Mm-hmm.
right now, community
Yeah,
resource sharing. I mean, because I actually
totally.
I do think this maybe we could come back to this question around
Mm-hmm.
agency in within the yoga class. Although
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a connection. When I talked to Matthew Remski the other day, I think
Mm-hmm.
he kind of brought it up that in a sense, moving out of the studio, like we've all had to move
Mm-hmm.
out of studio classes right now. So already
Yeah.
we have an opportunity to shift something, right? Something's
Mm-hmm.
in this moment related to the way that yoga
Definitely.
classes are taught. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that we are shifting how we're teaching yoga. And I do think that it's important to talk about how we are taking these classes online and what shifts we are making, in part because it's a necessity for the industry, and also because I believe that yoga classes present an opportunity, whether they're online or in person, for our students to practice agency and to learn that skill and to be able to translate it out of that environment into their life. And so in this moment where we're finding ourselves isolated and losing a lot of the opportunities we have in the regular day to day pre COVID to choose where we go
Mm.
and who we spend our time with and what businesses we're spending our money on, right? We still need to be able to connect to the options that are available for us. And it's still important to be practicing agency in this context. And we have this opportunity where folks, A, need a place to practice and connect to agency because so much else is outside of their control, that that's going to be part of coping and self-care and healing in this moment. But also that when we come out of this moment, when we are looking at rebuilding after this or building something new after this, if we want it to be based in equity, if we want it to be based in a different sort of power structure than the hierarchical model that everything's based in now, then we need to start teaching that in this
Yeah.
moment and preparing for our time outside of isolation.
Yeah. And especially regarding the um, financial side, that because
Mm-hmm.
economic, I think that's what the question is about, is around economics. And
Mm-hmm.
oh, here I was going to look at the question, and how we can expand this into economic structures that enable, oh, I see, non-liberation or injustice. So I guess to me, it's like about the questions around maybe the economics of, I don't know if it's economics of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh no, I see. It's about resource sharing and community right now.
Mm-hmm.
But how about with yoga? I guess that's where I'm wondering. I feel like the tension I'm seeing in the yoga world at the moment is like when you go online, do you charge for your class or not? And it's so
Hmm.
interesting because I see both sides. On the one side, you could say, oh, well, if you make it free, then it's more accessible. And so for students who don't have the money right now because of the economic challenges we're facing, there's this chance to access these practices. But then you have teachers who make a living from yoga who rely on that income and will be struggling if we don't pay them. So
Hmm.
to me, there's like some tension there between should online classes be free right now or not.
Yeah,
I don't
there's a
know.
big tension there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I have the ultimate answer about what any one person should do in terms of charging for their classes or keeping them free. Um, I think that this is an important moment for that discernment of what authority you as an individual, for each of us, is going to choose to listen to here. Um, are you going to um, are you going to let yourself or choose to exist within sort of the confines of capitalism, or are you going to find ways outside of it? And I am not placing judgment on one decision or the other because we undeniably live in capitalism and need to survive. So in that model, if we are sort of working with capitalism here and trying to find some sort of answer to that question of charging or not,
Yeah.
that side of my brain says that we shouldn't let things be free online. We need to pay the teachers.
Yeah.
And then there's the side of my brain that is coming from internal authority, where I feel like we should all have access to these resources, right? Yoga as a resource, yoga teaching as a resource, classes as a resource,
Yeah.
where I want them to be free, right? And accessible. Ultimately, um, I am still charging for most of my offerings. I'm doing what I can to make them financially accessible. I would
Hmm.
like to have bigger conversations, I think, in the yoga community right now about what sliding scale actually means and looks like in practice, because most of the time when I see that presented as a financial model or option, it's like, here's my regular price and here's a reduced rate that you can pay if you can't afford it. Where I think optimally, a system of sliding scale slides both ways, it slides up and down.
Hmm.
So maybe here's my median price
Yeah.
based on some industry standard, but there's a reduced scale over here and there's an increased scale over here that helps to subsidize those who need to pay the lesser rate and still ensure that the
Yeah.
work is paid fairly.
Yeah. Maybe we need to work on that for accessible yoga training. I
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our current structure is basically like, here's the price, here's an early bird discount, and then we offer scholarships, either full or
Mm-hmm.
part. And I think I like that personally. I mean, up to now the world's changed quickly, but I feel like because there's such a divide between people who have resources and those who don't, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
for people who have it, I want to say like this is the cost, but I also want to be totally accessible to those
Mm-hmm.
who don't. But I think, I mean, with the tiered pricing structure, which you described a little bit, I think there's that possibility that people just choose the level that they are able to afford right now. But also, the thing with that is, I think there still needs to be that free option. Like, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
often missing in a tiered structure,
Yeah.
um, or at least
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
yes, I think that is often missing in a tiered structure, and I think that as often as possible it should be available. Um, I think we also need to do some thinking collectively and individually around, what actually constitutes enough now for each individual person, and what is our
yeah,
responsibility to one another, and
yeah,
how do we create financial models such as like tiered pricing or sliding scale that goes up and down, that
yeah,
we each can feel empowered to make our own choices, not necessarily with like this authoritarian oversight saying like, send me your last tax statement so I can figure out what tier you need to be in, right? But where we're also holding ourselves to account in terms of what we're able to afford. Because I do understand that scarcity thinking within capitalism makes us all think that we don't have enough, and that, that tier of that upper tier, or that higher end of the scale is
Yeah.
not for us, right?
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
I
It's
think,
so interesting.
mhm, I think that we need to have more conversations around that scarcity mindset as well. Um, and that comes back to agency and resources in so many ways. Um, that that authority of capitalism that we have all internalized and ingrained makes us believe that we have fewer options in terms of how we spend our money than we
Right.
actually do.
Yeah.
And in some ways, and for me, people paying that upper tier is actually not a viable option based on the level of financial resources available to you. But the trick of capitalism is to make us all believe that that applies to us, right?
Mm.
And so this comes back to some of that discernment of, are you listening to that authority of capitalism that's coming from outside of you, or are you listening to an internal authority that will tell you when you have enough?
Yeah. And I think you touched on something, um, just that kind of the capitalist thinking that there's never enough, that there's more is
Mm-hmm.
always better. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I've seen, and maybe it's just because of who I follow on social media, but I've seen so much discussion about that right now with
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic, and just like really, and maybe it's the general public right now is more conscious of it because of what's happening, and that everyone is under pressure. So there's more like
Mm-hmm.
awareness floating up about the inequities in our society, at least in the US. I
Mm-hmm.
know other capitalist systems also suffer in the same way, but in the US, it's clear that, like, certain people get access to testing for this virus or access to better healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Certain communities have better healthcare in general anyway. In the US, not everyone has healthcare, right?
Right.
It's not universal,
Mm-hmm.
which is just shocking. So, I mean, I guess there's an opportunity here for change. I hope that we'll
Mm-hmm.
learn from this and realize that these concepts of community care, that like we all need to take care of each other, um, will rise up through through this disaster, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think to come back to the part of this that is meant to be a queer perspective too, um, there's a reason that we were taking this as a queer perspective, which was to say that, like, because of this perspective that we may have through queer or trans experience, we have potentially practiced exactly what we're talking about, which is sort of
Mm,
reestablishing an understanding of constructed systems, including capitalism, essentially,
mm,
but definitely in terms of like our care systems. And I think about family because that's something that we can point to that's been historically denied in the sense of like legal marriage and adoption and structures like that. Basically, queer communities have been
yeah.
historically cut off from the mechanisms to build family in the sense that maybe the majority population understands it, but that doesn't mean that we haven't always had families, right?
Right.
We just had to rely on
Yeah.
the internal authority to say, like, this is the family I'm going to create. And we dreamt that up and we made it happen before the structures were in place to align our families with the state, potentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me laugh because I mean, what my husband and I went through,
Mm-hmm.
um, all for so many years where gay marriage was not legal, and the
Mm-hmm.
kind of hurdles we had to jump through to prove we
Mm-hmm.
had this commitment to each other, and that it also could be reflected in our financial arrangement, in our wills, in our desire to adopt children. Like I mean, it's been unbelievable. We had to get married probably at least 3 times because the laws kept changing in California. We got married once a long, long time ago just for ourselves. We didn't think that it would ever be legal at that point, and we just did it
Mm-hmm.
early on in our relationship. And then Eventually, it was legal in California, so we got married, but it wasn't legal federally, so it didn't really
Hmm.
count. In fact, during those years, we had to submit our taxes two different ways. We had to file as married in California and then as not married for the federally.
Hmm.
And we had to actually analyze our taxes differently. The one time we got audited by the IRS, and the guy from the IRS called me, and I had to teach him how to do the taxes. So the guy from the IRS, I had
Yeah.
to explain to him because of the discrepancy between marriage laws in California and federal government. I was doing it correctly, which I was.
Hmm.
Anyway, so then we did finally get married a third time when it was legal in the US.
Yeah.
That was just, that wasn't that long ago.
Yep.
But it definitely impacted our family. We had to adopt our children individually first as single parents and then do second parent adoptions. I mean, it was just so convoluted and the
Hmm.
endless hurdles, we've had. Um, anyway, we should probably bring it back to yoga though. So there were a few questions. Um, One question it's Taruki. Are there any organizations that apply the flexible financial models? And I would say,
Mm,
I know that Off the Mat does that tiered pricing. I really appreciate that
hmm.
there. And someone else answered him. Good. And
Great.
and I'd say that we, in Accessible Yoga, we always offer scholarships for everything, at
Yeah.
least everything I run.
Hmm.
Um, so that's always an option. Okay, so what else? Should we go back to, did you have something else I think you were going to say?
I mean, uh, when we started talking about family structure, right, beyond just the particulars of our individual situations, which are interesting in exemplifying what we're talking about, but
Yeah,
are also like a little distraction from the point.
yeah,
Like I grew up not thinking I would be able to get married legally in the United States, but that didn't stop me from wanting to have a committed relationship or multiple committed relationships, or stop me from wanting to have children in my life to create some sort of family structure. But
mhm,
without that template being prescribed to me by a tradition, because, remaining in my church was out at that point as an option. And so, like, there goes the religious aspect of marriage, right? And having a legal marriage was out at the time. That meant, like, I had to dream up a new structure that was going to work for me and for
right.
any potential partner that I may have, right? And I think that understanding how to do that, that is a skill, right? Seeing beyond the structures that are in place and the information that's being fed to us and the constructs that have been ingrained in us over time. It can be really hard to divorce yourself from those things if you don't have a reason, such as you're gay and you have to, right?
Yeah,
Like, you and I were almost forced to, um,
yeah,
which I think is a like silver lining. But um, if you don't have that, then it's a little more work and just like your own labor to break yourself of that thinking. But there's so much freedom in that thinking, right? And
yeah,
so that's to come back to yoga too. I think that's something that we can be teaching in our classes that's very much aligned with the teachings of yoga, right? I wrote in a blog post a couple of years ago that the two moments in my life that had the most impact on me, in the sense that it felt like it was really freeing my mind, freeing my thinking, but also so in alignment with what was coming out from within me, was coming out as a queer person and finding yoga and reading some of the first like introductions to philosophy. That like
yeah,
both of those things resonated so much with an internal experience that I was having, that I knew I couldn't put them down or let them go, right?
yeah,
Something in there felt like truth. And so those experiences are now experiences that I try to translate into my experiences today beyond those things, right? When it resonates, when it aligns with all of the other truths that I think I know, whatever they
right.
might be, um, can
And
I
so
take
let
that
me just,
and
I just
implement
want to
it?
repeat what you just said, because what you said is that, that in a way, queer people have been forced to create different systems and have that skill. And I think we could use that we've used it within
Mm-hmm.
yoga. I think we can do it now also,
Mm-hmm.
as all of us look at a new world and how we can
Mm-hmm.
create new structures that are more equitable, more accessible. And that's actually one of the
Absolutely.
questions about, can we address the awakening happening culturally as a result of COVID and how we can harness prana as a community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I just said about like, if you don't have that spur, such as being queer and having to dream up your own family structure, um, this is a spur in a lot of ways, right? And that comes back to this agency question of that we were starting with. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
this is a moment where something that we took for granted, or many things that we might have taken for granted within our systems, are being removed from our control. And we are now forced to think about what the future is going to be and look at alternative models, because clearly what we had structurally before wasn't working. And that was
yeah,
clear to those of us who it wasn't working for, the marginalized communities, right? But it's now become more clear to everybody, right? So, in the same way that perhaps marginalized communities had some of these skills for dreaming up different structures and different systems and different futures before,
hmm,
and maybe the general population is just now waking up to that,
yeah,
and starting to learn that skill.
yeah.
We as marginalized communities also have those skills already and are able to now teach them to the folks who didn't have to learn that lesson through some other spur in the past.
Right. I mean, in a way, it's so great to hear you talk about it like this. I just feel like it really, um, I don't know, makes something that I've felt very concrete personally, and that I really appreciate
Mm-hmm.
that. Can you, I mean, maybe it's too much to ask, but we have just a short time left. I mean, do you have
Mm-hmm.
some ideas of what that could be? Like, what are some of the gifts that, we as a queer community, we can give the world, like right now? Like, what is it that, and maybe in yoga, we could focus there.
Mm-hmm.
If you could can you think of some things?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I keep coming back to is an understanding of non-hierarchy and of spectrum, and understanding things as existing along spectrums, rather than in that
Yeah,
vertical power
yeah,
structure, right, in this horizontal way, which
yeah,
is something that queer folks have had to address, through building relationships, through building communities, and
yeah,
through building families. The default power structure within a two-person coupling, that comes from sort of like a monogamous heterosexual relationship.
yeah,
We don't have that. So how do we create our own power structure, if there is going to be one, or can we work in a more horizontal way,
yeah,
right? But that is one of those things that I think at least touches a universal truth in some way, and that needs to be translated and applied, outside of just our family units and into larger units or society, um, our globe, right? And also maybe internally, like moving both directions, how do we apply non-hierarchy and spectrum understanding bigger and inward,
yeah.
micro and macro?
So
Um,
within yoga, are you thinking about within classes or within other structures?
mhm,
Like, are you both?
both.
Okay.
I mean, I'm thinking within business structures in the yoga industry, which are also hierarchies, right? We usually
Mhm.
have like a CEO or a studio owner, and then we have, their middle management, and then we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
their worker bees, right? Um, and that is a power structure in and of itself. I think that power structures detract from our ability to see things clearly and to give consent. So
Mm.
I think of hierarchical structures as inherently non-consensual, unless you have really communicated about the power structure that you're intending to build.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a whole different conversation. When we're forced into a hierarchy, there's an element of non-consent there. And so
Mm.
I'm thinking business structures needing to move towards horizontal models, which could be worker owners, sort of co-op models, collaborative, collaborative structures, right?
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about the way that we teach our classes, which, as you've already said, are presented in a hierarchical way, where the teacher is, up on this pedestal, and then there's everybody else, and
Yeah.
how we can make classes more collaborative and more horizontal,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, I just have to speak
Mm-hmm.
up and say that's my passion, and I think that you too. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen you teach classes that way. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful, and I think that's what we're doing in accessible yoga is trying to, educate the yoga community around that, around how you could teach in a way that's more empowering to the students, giving them authority and agency over themselves, their bodies, and
Mm-hmm.
the choices they make in the class by showing lots of different a spectrum, like you said, a spectrum of possibility. And I love that that's kind
Yeah.
of like the analogy of the queer spectrum or like the gender
Mm-hmm.
spectrum. And I mean, yeah, even the word spectrum for me is meaningful because it reminds me of the rainbow. And that's what I'm working on in my book right now is like, how can I'm trying to talk about what is the like queer version of yoga philosophy and the teachings. Like, how can you
Mm-hmm.
look at them in more that open-ended way rather than the way I think yoga philosophy is often taught is very much like a hierarchy,
Yeah.
of like one or the other or like
Yeah.
duality, and I think that our community hasn't always seen the world that way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I would just say for accessible yoga, like I'm thinking about this a lot for us as an organization and doing these talks, like trying to platform voices that don't get attention. I think at this moment, I need that. I need to hear from you and other people who are doing this work. That's why I'm doing this, is to kind of like, to me, this was an opportunity to have more conversations and to
Mm-hmm.
lift voices that are marginalized. And for myself to hear the wisdom of people in our community. And also, I'm really looking at how our organization can step up and create more platforms for teachers through our conferences or through maybe a digital platform. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't say because I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm working on new ideas, that have kind of sprung from this moment. And I think, what it's kind of like what you're saying helps me to ground it in my personal background in a clear way. So I really appreciate that. As
Sure.
always, I always appreciate you. So we're almost done. I mean, I don't think we should go much longer, but do you have any other thoughts you want to share before we?
um, Unless you have more specific questions for me, I will write a blog post with some additional thoughts
Yeah.
for accessible yoga because I frankly just have way more thoughts than this that we could talk about for hours.
Yeah.
But I won't.
It seems like a book, maybe.
Well, yes,
I mean,
exactly.
yeah, and because I feel like there's like we just said it towards the end. I mean, there's applying this in yoga as a business. There's applying this in yoga in the classroom and the way we
Mm-hmm.
teach. I mean, both of those topics are essential, and like we need to be having those conversations more in both ways. And I feel like there is that opening right now. So it's
Yeah.
exciting in a way. I mean, it's devastating and
Mm-hmm.
sad, and I don't need to make light of what is happening in the world, but I feel um, like you were saying, I mean, we've learned, those of us that have learned from struggle kind of get that. We are doing that again. Like, here's
Yeah.
another struggle that we can learn to adapt to in some way, I hope,
Yes.
and actually improve, maybe.
Yeah. And yeah, I would echo that. I'm not trying to make light, and this is a tragedy and it's terrible. But I do think that we're seeing broader awakening, and like for me, that is tapas, right? Is like
Mm,
we need to not we don't want to cause harm, but when suffering is unavoidable, we still need to stick with it and learn from it and apply what we learn from it to make things better, right? To
mm,
reduce harm in the future. And that's part of
mm,
what's happening right now. And what I
mm.
can appreciate about this is that it's happening on a larger scale, um,
Yeah.
which is both the tragedy of it and the opportunity of it, right?
Yeah, and I love what you just said about tapas being about preventing more harm in the future. I feel like that's often lost when we talk about tapas. I mean, I know we should probably wrap up, but
Mm-hmm.
that's really a great insight because I think if you look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, I mean, he mentions tapas, and then he talks about a little right after that, just 15 sutras later, talks about future pain is avoidable. So that's exactly
Mhm.
right. It's like it's not that you want pain, but when it comes, oh, what can I learn from this so I don't have to go through this again, or so that other
Mhm.
people don't have to suffer.
Right.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, thanks for
Thank you.
this talk. It's great to see you.
Absolutely. You too.
And I
Always.
know I'll probably talk to you tomorrow.
Probably.
Okay, great.
Well,
And I'm sure there'll be what?
mhm. No, go ahead.
I was going to say there are lots of questions that maybe you could answer later, or we can all just
Yeah,
wait for your blog post about it. I'm sure that'll be
I
coming soon.
will I will go through the comments that were in the chat and answer what I can.
Okay.
And I'll be writing that blog post that'll sum up a few more things. We meandered a little bit. So I know some of what I really like to talk about is so heady sometimes and so conceptual. And like
Yeah.
without a lot of time to provide context, it can be difficult to understand all of the ties. But I'll do my best to kind of tie all of what we talked about together for everybody
Great.
in the community group.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for everything you do.
Sure.
I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Okay.
I
Bye.
appreciate you.
Bye.
Bye.